Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks, and glad to be back. This is episode 41, and we're recording this on December 17th, 2023.
There have been several big stories since we last recorded. We begin with the Ukraine and the fight over continued aid and military support in the U.S. Congress. Then, tensions have been heating up between the Philippines and China and the South China Sea. What does this mean for the United States? Tensions are also heating up in South America over a territorial dispute between Venezuela and Guyana. Will the U.S. need to intervene? Right-wing populists have made another gain with the election of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. As former residents of the country, we offer our perspective. Finally, we make some foreign policy predictions of the year ahead. Well, so we don't really talk about Israel in this episode, but some of its politics have become local to the community, particularly with several teachers who've been accused of anti-Semitic comment.
Yeah, so we just wanted to, even though normally we start with a lighter topic than this.
This was your idea. I was going to talk about the holidays.
I know, but I felt like since we aren't going to discuss the Israeli-Hamas war, and obviously that's what dominates most mainstream coverage of U.S. foreign policy lately, that this is coming up locally. I mean, I think everybody has very strong opinions on it, and it's touched the average U.S. citizen's life in some way where they have strong opinions about it, or it's become very political in nature. So one of these things that's been pointed out is our daughter attends school in Montgomery County in Maryland, and there have been 3 teachers that have been suspended since the October 7th attack by Hamas. And I think what's I kind of wanted to discuss was kind of that line between anti-Semitism, which I think has a clear definition around attacking the Jewish people and people of the Jewish faith, versus anti-Zionism, which I think is more complicated definition because I think it's beyond like the criticism of the current Israeli government, but rather can go as far as criticism of the entire Israel project from 1948 onwards. So I think it's interesting looking at 2 different cases with these teachers. So the first one was around comments of, and this one I think rose to the closest of being possibly anti-Semitic because it touched on kind of denying the Hamas attack. So basically this one teacher posted that Hamas did not start this on Facebook. They were just the perfect vehicle for Zionists to continue its apartheid. And I think the way that this was read was that this is almost a conspiracy theory by Zionists in order to subjugate and remove the Gazan people. So this is all just a faked attack.
I mean, I think this is anti-Semitic. I think it goes close to denying the Holocaust. The Hamas attack is well evidenced. It is horrific, absolutely horrific. And I'm definitely on the anti-Semitic side of this.
Yeah, and I think I support that one too. And that one I think was the most clear-cut out of the different postings from different teachers. So now if we pivot towards the teacher that was actually at our daughter's school, she posted a series of 3 different posts. So the first was a post shared on Instagram, and it depicted a bomb covered in the Israeli flag and pointed at a child surrounded by bomb buildings. This one, to me, doesn't rise to even like anti-Zionism. I mean, it's clearly a political statement, but I don't see any personal issue with this first one.
Yeah.
The second post is I do have an issue with for different reasons. So she was discussing this around having an art class outside in the courtyard. and then sent a text over a video that read, okay, art class outside. I have a very heavy heart, praying for justice so that there might be peace, and a small graphic of a fist with the Palestinian flag overlaid. And then in the video, she says, made it to class on Friday. I'm grateful for that because there are a lot of people in the world who didn't. It's been a hell of a week. But then the video briefly pans to show her students working on their sketch assignments. And nothing within the message of the video, if it was outside of the school, I don't think that rises to anything. Kind of normal political speech is fine. But the fact that she used the students as props in political speech, I had a real issue with.
Yeah, of course. Of course. There's no consent there, and teachers should not be able to film their students without consent and put it on social media.
Yeah, so I think that's the number one reason for potentially, but it wasn't raised as an issue. It wasn't the fact that she used students as a political prop, but rather that this was anti-Semitic, which I don't agree with these first two. Now, this third one is probably the most controversial. This one was, again, a post on Instagram and has a black and red eye centered, and then the text, "The world is watching, Palestine will be free," and then follows, "Colonized peoples across the world stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people against Israel's settler colonial state-sanctioned apartheid program of genocide backed by U.S. imperialism. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Decolonization is not a metaphor." So what do you make of that?
This is such a difficult topic. I certainly see the perspective of anti-Semitism in this, essentially almost calling for the end of the Israeli state. I mean, it's kind of understandable that Palestinians would feel this way about the creation of an Israeli state. But I do think that this is anti-Semitism in some form. Yeah, I'm leaning on that.
And I think this is where it becomes difficult. I would say also, I think this is anti-Semitism because clearly it calls for the end of the Israeli state, which that phrase, which has drawn a lot of attention and media coverage, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," implies, the destruction of the Israeli state. And that alone could just be a Zionist or a political statement. But given the history of the Jewish people, given why the Israeli state was founded, it kind of rises to that level where you get that the people and that nation in particular is associated with the people, that it rises to anti-Semitism. But I get how that also becomes, and it may be controversial.
Yeah.
In the take of it. So it's kind of this, and there's a lot of discussion around that border. Obviously, we saw before Congress, the three presidents of Yale, Harvard, and Penn about anti-Semitic remarks being made by students on campus there. They were, I think, rightfully criticized for giving pretty ambiguous sort of academic responses. I mean, it was very kind of intellectual, which does not work in a public setting in front of Congress. And they got taken to task, and the Penn president already lost her job over it. So I was kind of curious, coming from an academic's perspective, what your thoughts were on that.
I think it's complicated, but I think there are clear instances of anti-Semitism that's hate speech and should clearly not be allowed on campus. Though there are a lot of borderline comments, kind of like we've talked about, and where does that fall under free speech? I mean, from my perspective, you should say, well, the Great Replacement theory should not be allowed to be spoken on campuses because that's anti-Semitic.
Yeah, that's where I'm totally on board. I think they have no problem going after people that are clearly Nazis, especially if they're white. They should apply that same lens towards anybody that's ethnically different, but expressing essentially the same anti-Semitic views.
Yeah. So I think, but I don't know that schools say that you can't talk about the Great Replacement theory.
Yeah, no, I don't think they do. And clearly we saw a presidential candidate, Vivek Ramaswamy, in the last debate make that just part mainstream. And apparently it's part of the standard Democratic platform, great replacement theory. So.
Right. So, I mean, I think there's a complexity there that should be realized. But at the same time, there is definitely certain speech that just simply qualifies as hate speech.
Yeah. So right or wrong.
I do hate the politics of it, though.
Yeah, right or wrong on the Penn president being forced out and the pressure kind of on Harvard.
Wrong. The university, I think they should have taken a more clear stance and saying anti-Semitism is hate speech and that's not allowed. I mean, I wish they just made clear statements like that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure in trying to address the complexity of free speech, which I think they did not do in a great manner, should be cause for them to be removed from their positions.
Yeah, and it was interesting seeing how that developed because it was mostly the larger financial backers of those universities that put the pressure on it. So now there's a discussion, and maybe you can weigh on this also as an academic, is there's a push to not have academics heading up universities anymore, but have somebody that has more of a business mindset. Since essentially, especially with these universities, they're just private wealth managers who have $50 billion in assets that they manage. It's more a business than an academic institution anymore.
That's the problem. I think that's a terrible idea.
But that's the truth of it. And that's really what led to Penn especially being so tied closely to Wall Street. It's ruled by capitalists. It's not this bastion of free inquiry anymore by academics. But the interesting thing, I think, with Harvard is you did have the professoriate rally around the president. So you've had like 700 professors kind of come out and support, maybe because they saw what happened at Penn.
Right. And I mean, free speech is important. Like I said, hate speech should never be allowed. But there's all these unclear lines that it is important to preserve. And I think the last thing universities need is to be run by business people because it's already essentially run by business people. I mean,
this should just be formalizing it.
Yeah. Too much. If we think about what we want out of education and then we think about what we get from the business-like orientation, I think there's a big discrepancy. And I think the last thing we want is to make it even more of a business. I mean, then it kind of becomes just almost like buying degrees.
It's not that way already.
We'll see.
As undergrads are your customers.
Yeah. And more they're treated like customers instead of trying to actually teach them something and uphold academic standards. Right. That's why there's such huge grade inflation, which of course is, as you huge at Harvard, known for being huge at Harvard.
Yeah.
But across the board, when student complaints are treated like customer complaints and err on the side of students, which is an experience that I've had, then what is, you can't teach, really. You can't at least uphold them having to do well on tests or study or things like that.
Yeah.
So you can't actually uphold that they're learning something. They're just there for 4 years. They get this degree that gives them access to the right people and the right jobs.
Yeah. Now, for the record, I agree with you. I think it's at least the symbolically academic should be in charge, even if the reality is different.
Well, that was really heavy banter.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we could use the word banter.
This is just jumping right into the deep end.
Okay, well, let's go to something that has been kind of discouraging to me and I think as well to you. And this is the fact that Congress has still not approved of any additional funding to aid Ukraine in its war against Russia.
Yeah, so we saw this week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky came to D.C. basically in a last-ditch effort to try to put some sort of pressure on Congress to pass additional aid of $60 billion for the war effort against Russia. And in fact, he gave a speech at the National Defense University.
Yeah, he did, which was kind of cool. It would have been cooler if I was able to attend, but there's only so much room in the auditorium, and most faculty was not allowed in there, but all the students were there. So yeah, it was neat. I mean, I just saw the live stream, but it was really cool.
Yep. And I think that probably, if I had to guess, was the highlight of his visit. It was at the very beginning. And then the rest, frankly, was fairly depressing. So basically where we stand right now is the U.S. since the start of the war has provided about $71 billion in aid to Ukraine. And it's basically fully drained at this point. The DoD reported that about 97% of those funds had been spent as of mid-November. The State Department, all of its allocated funds have been spent. And it seems like with the House having recently gone on break for the remaining of the Christmas vacation, that Congress will not be taking action this year. And this is really being driven by the fact that Republicans have held that aid hostage in order to get stronger border security and immigration restrictions. And essentially what this means, according to the New Yorker, is that Republicans want to see some version of a previously passed House bill called the Secure the Border Act, which essentially would substantially curtail the current asylum system, fund construction of more of the border wall with Mexico, and then effectively push those asylum seekers and keep them in Mexico. And it seems like, unlike previous negotiations around immigration reform, there's really no talk of any sort of legal pathway, which since the Trump era has really become toxic for Republicans in terms of being seen weak on immigration. So this is really being framed as kind of a zero-sum deal. So that being said, there was a Politico article late last week that reported some progress currently in the Senate, which is still in session for the remainder of this week. But it's really not clear. Listening on the Republican side, it didn't sound like they felt they were very close. And then it's also not clear whether the House would actually take up a bill, even if it did pass the Senate. So pretty discouraging at this stage.
It's terrible. I mean, it's allowing Russia to win. It's saying, one, we're saying to Ukraine, we'll support you however long this takes, which is a logical position because you don't want Russia to win.
Right.
And now we're saying, I mean, if that aid doesn't get to Ukraine, like, how are they supposed to fight the war against Russia? It's a almost complete capitulation to Russia. I'm just horrified by it that this may come to pass, that we may not get a funding bill and what that means for foreign policy.
Yeah, it would be catastrophic. We'll talk a little bit later about that. I'm still hopeful, just because the fact that even among Republicans, that support for future aid is still over 50%. And I think polling shows that there's general still popularity for supporting Ukraine.
But, big but, is there's a lot of issues that the majority of Republicans support but don't get represented because essentially a minority of Republicans have hijacked the party and are able to keep things from coming to the floor or from threatening the speakership. So just because a majority support it, a slim majority, does not mean that the Republican Party will feel the need to represent that majority.
Yeah, it would. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a combination of like the U.S. does the right thing after every other option is exhausted, but it would be one of the biggest cell phones in the history of U.S. foreign policy if we really capitulated and didn't fund any additional around the war. That being said, we can't answer that now. We could just be hopeful that in the early months of the next year that they will eventually get their act together and pass something. That being said, Zelensky had a very bad week in the EU as well, because the EU was looking to put together its appropriations for $55 billion in aid. That was blocked because, again, it requires a unanimous vote, and the 27-member EU was blocked by, of course, Viktor Orban and Hungary. So this puts Ukraine in a very weak position. Putin course, has taken advantage of that. He held his first press conference within Russia, press kind of in quotations, but there were questions from the public that were fielded. This is the first press conference since December 2021 for Putin. But it was almost like it was definitely, he feels like he's in a position of strength. He noted that there shouldn't be a need for a second mobilization of troops, that there already, because of the previous partial mobilizations, there's 600,000 Russian troops currently within Ukraine. And I think what was interesting, I mean, obviously mostly propaganda, but it was the fact that Russia thinks it can still win the whole thing, that it can meet all of its objectives, especially now, especially after this week. He reaffirmed the claims that much of today's Ukraine, including the Black Sea port of Odessa and the coastal areas, historically belonged to Russia. This was something, again, he had stated kind of in his long, rambling speech right before the invasion. And he declared that the goals of his war have not changed since the start, and that there would only be peace once those goals were achieved, being the denazification of Ukraine, its demilitarization, and its neutral status, which is essentially complete capitulation of Kiev.
Yeah, I mean, this is the game Putin has been playing all along. How long will the West support Ukraine? There was so much patting ourselves on the back in the way that the West united instead of kind of falling apart when it came to supporting Ukraine in the war against Russia. But Putin has, like Russia always has the numbers, has been able to keep the economy going. And all they've had to do this whole time is to outlast the West. And it looks like it's succeeding.
Yeah, exactly. So it seems like he's made this strategic choice, and certainly, as we talked about last time, really betting on the outcomes of the US 2024 presidential election to give him the maximum strength. And if he chooses, I mean, if we end up capitulating, he could get the whole thing, which would be highly desirable. But at the best, if he's forced into a negotiated solution, to have maximum gains under a Trump administration.
I don't get it. I don't get at all how Republicans can say that they want a strong America. They want a strong United States, that the Democrats have weakened the U.S. in international affairs. And then at the same hand, decide we're not going to support Ukraine anymore. We have other priorities. And so essentially we're going to empower Russia, who is challenging the very international world order that we helped set up. And we say we want to preserve against China. So we just let another powerful country violate those terms and win, and then think that you're making America stronger? I don't get it. It makes me mad, as if you can't tell.
Yeah, no, I like the passion. I like it. No, and so I think the refrain that we've been seeing, and then kind of the analysis, has now really turned to, well, what are the implications of a Russian victory? What would this mean for the U.S., for NATO, for Europe, for China, for other powers that are looking to kind of rewrite the current world order? So two of them came out, which we'll link to. So the first was the Institute for the Study of War, which has been great kind of in its coverage of this war and on kind of latest maps. And then Vox's piece, What Happens in Ukraine If USA Disappears. I think in the Institute, the Study of War, really laid out the fact, the tremendous cost that both the US and Europe would incur if you had Russian forces who are now battle-tested, battle-hardened. You push up very sophisticated anti-air defense batteries up to the border of Poland, of Eastern Europe, of the Baltic republics. And that would essentially mean having to position at Cold War levels U.S. troops in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states in order to serve as this effective deterrence. Because, again, we should take Putin at his word. He wants to restore the Russian Empire. That means taking first Georgia and Moldova, and then taking the Baltic republics. And I think these threats have to be taken seriously. In order to deter them, you're going to have to spend billions and billions and billions more housing these troops, which of course pulls them away from the Asia Pacific.
Right. We say we want this pivot to China, and we say that and I say we, Republicans are extraordinarily vocal about this, about the Chinese threat and the U.S. ability to counter that threat. And this action seriously hinders our ability to do so. Like you said, it pulls our attention, our troops, our resources to this area of the world and does not allow us to focus on China and East Asia. There's only so much we can do at one time. And if we have all these troops that we have to keep in Europe, then those are troops that we can't put in East Asia to try to prevent a Taiwanese invasion or even have the resources to help prevent or respond to a Taiwanese invasion by China. So again, this is one of the most idiotic things we could do that directly threatens our own national security. This isn't just about Ukraine, some country that we may or may not care about because we're the US and we don't always care about smaller countries. We should care about Russia, even if we don't care about Ukraine, and about the resources we have to put into countering a real Russian threat if they make this substantial progress in Ukraine, let alone fully capture Ukraine. I mean, it's almost unthinkable. But the fact is, you look at what will happen if we don't find a way to get this funding. And part of me is a little bit like you that will eventually do it, hopefully in some.
Just because it seems like such a no-brainer from
but it would be
so many angles.
It's terrible, horrific if we don't find that funding. And somewhere they must recognize that.
That's the hope, that is recognized. So in terms of the time frame, I mean, I think Vox kind of laid it out from quotes from various ex-military working in DC think tanks. How quickly will they feel this effect on the battlefield? Now, obviously, they're already restrained. They're already having to really limit the amount of artillery that's being used. But the quotes they're saying is like, in maybe 2 months, Ukrainians will begin to have a hard time doing counterattacks. Then by the summer, they'll be really hard pressed just to defend themselves against Russian attacks. And that's where you'll potentially see loss of territory. Now, in terms of what they'll pursue then is what a lot of analysts expect at the beginning of the war, where they thought Ukraine military had no chance of being able to defend its territories, where they'll pull back into urban centers and do more asymmetric strategies. So pulling them into urban centers and then fighting them in urban combat, which of course is hell for the civilian population.
We shouldn't even be talking about that. I mean, we really should not have to be talking about that when we've made all this progress over these years.
I know. It's insane. And we're going to get into the ROI on the U.S.'s personal investment. We do talk about that Russia has responded remarkably well. Nevertheless, U.S. intelligence has estimated that of the original forces that started the conflict with Ukraine, Russia has suffered 90% casualties. So that original 300,000, 90,000 or 90% of them are out of commission effectively. Yep. Ukraine's been enormously effective in bleeding the Russian war machine. That being said, they have responded, they have started their industrial base, but I think that then pivots to what about our industrial base and what benefits has it seen? Obviously, it's been too slow, but when we talk about spending approved for that $71 billion, about $44 billion of that is direct military assistance, and the vast majority of that goes back into U.S. industries. And I think this was a good pivot that the Biden administration made in terms of pitching this, particularly to Republican congressmen. And the fact is, this money has benefited overwhelmingly states in red districts, in Arizona, in Arkansas, and in Pennsylvania. So it's really just a jobs program also that circulates back into the U.S., plus it builds up the industrial base for potential conflict with China.
Right. One of the biggest concerns with a potential conflict with China is how quickly war games show that we run out of munitions within days. And we know like how long it takes to replace that, which can take years. And so one of the concerns is the ability of the industrial base to surge, for us to increase stockpiles, and the ability to replace the weapons that are being used in any eventual potential conflict. And the problem is larger than just what we manufacture in weapons, but just losing so many manufacturing jobs altogether and just not having that technical know-how. So I was a little bit surprised about how much of this money is going to Arkansas, of all places. Everyone should know Arkansas is my home state. And there's several good articles you pointed out to me about Camden, Arkansas, where they make the HMAR system, which of course has been so crucial to the war in Ukraine. These are really good jobs. Camden, Arkansas is this very small town that had lost a lot of its population, and the storefronts had been boarded up, and now there's more jobs than they can fill, and people are moving into the community, and they're starting to see a little bit of revival in the downtown area. These are the kind of jobs we say we want in America. I feel a little bit weird saying, oh, we should be continuing in a war because it's providing good jobs to Americans. I don't feel 100% comfortable. But the fact is, we do need this sort of production desperately to face the kind of problems that the U.S. has internationally. I mean, we have several conflicts that are going on, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And the U.S. needs to have the ability to respond on multiple fronts. And to do that, you do need to have this industrial base, which could also go back into like the 90s and at the end of the Cold War, and how so much of this was shuttered and how much consolidation happened and how much was lost in the industry. And so much this is coming back because of Ukraine, the need to support Ukraine, the need to replace those stockpiles. So it's not like the war in Ukraine ends and these jobs go away, but that we need to replace stockpiles. And there's more recognition of what stockpiles we may need, what production lines we may need to keep open in the case of an eventual conflict with China.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, and let's be clear that, yeah, you talked about kind of the continuation of the war, but I think we saw clearly that, yeah, Russia's in no position. They don't want to lock in the lines where they are now. They still think and have absolutist goals for the complete defeat of Ukraine. So this is about protecting sovereign democratic nation at the border of Europe from invasion from Russia. And at minimum, we need to give them the arms to hold the current lines.
Yeah. And like I said, we don't need these weapons just for now, just for Ukraine. We need them for the kind of future responses that the U.S. might have in various conflicts around the world, but particularly in our concern about a conflict with China. And one way to deter is to make sure that you have the capacity to be able to fight a war.
Yeah, there may not be as much overlap. For instance, there's probably not going to be huge artillery need in a war with China, but definitely like the air defense has been a huge component of what aid we provide to Ukraine and has helped save countless lives and protect their infrastructure. That absolutely is going to be super relevant for any sort of Taiwan-China war.
Well, and think about, I mean, it's not a simple process, but even if you have production lines making munitions that are not the same ones you would need in a conflict with China, you have production lines that can be converted to the type of weapons that you need. So this is all stuff that we talk a lot about in the industrial mobilization class that I teach. And it's really critical if you think about what might happen and what the U.S. needs to at least be prepared for.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just having that training, the extra capacity, the skilled workforce. I mean, just getting, especially in an area like Camden, Arkansas, and having great jobs to have like a skilled, trained workforce there.
Yeah, and the local college is trying to gear more to providing those skills.
Yeah.
It's been difficult for them to find qualified people. And the good thing is a lot of people are moving in, but it also reflects in the U.S. this need to be able to provide technical education that isn't necessarily college level.
Like an associate degree or
but
trade
is
school.
much higher than a high school level.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so all these issues are interesting kind of represented when you look into Camden, Arkansas. but it certainly, I think, should not just be thought of like, oh, we give free money around the world, because most of that money ends up funding our enterprises, our businesses, our industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So speaking of China, and we typically talk about it in the terms of a possible Taiwanese invasion, but there are other definitely important tensions that happen between China and U.S. allies. And one of these that has been heating up over the past year is between China and the Philippines over a part of the Spratly Islands that Philippines has claim to. These waters are home to very rich fishing grounds and potentially some gas and oil deposits. So just the background quickly on Spratly Islands. It's a disputed archipelago in the South China Sea. It's composed of islands, inlets, cays, and more than 100 reefs, sometimes grouped in submerged old atolls. It lies off the coast of the Philippines, Malaysia, and southern Vietnam. In the particular part of this dispute, there was a 2016 arbitration, which overwhelmingly found in the Philippines' favor for this territory against China. But China has refused to acknowledge this ruling. So some of the incidents that have occurring, in February, China flashed a military-grade laser to a crew, which is blinding and is normally concerning because militaries might do this before launching an attack. One of the biggest problems, which has been seen in March and December, is swarming. Swarming is the deployment of a flotilla of vessels to intimidate or overwhelm a target, which has been a signature move used by China to assert its presence. So basically, China sends a combination of the Coast Guard, Navy, and militia vessels, which, just to quickly say about those, they're fishing vessels technically, but they are armed more like military vessels to surround a site and block and cut off target ships. So basically, it is preventing the fishing vessels from the Philippines from accessing its own territorial waters. These fishing vessels, which are armed like militia vessels, are nominally civilians that work with the state, but there's this very clear blend of civilian and military in these cases. And so this has happened in significant cases in both March and December. China's also deployed water cannons against the Philippine vessels, which is fairly uncommon. And so they did so in August, and they've done so quite recently. In the past week, the Philippines sent 2 missions in the disputed area, a humanitarian mission to distribute goods to fishermen, and a resupply mission to an outpost on the second Thomas Shoal. China used a water cannon 8 times on the fishing vessels in the first mission and then 4 times on the resupply mission. So things are in danger of escalating between the two countries. There's a real fear that this might spill over into some sort of violent conflict. And if that happened, the U.S. then is obligated to respond with its military agreement with the Philippines. And a larger issue is also just generally China's control over the South China Sea, which has important shipping routes. So it challenges open shipping in international waters.
Yeah, so this was, the New York Times has had really great coverage on this issue.
As has the Washington Post, because I got a lot of those incidents from them.
Yeah, there's a great one. And it's really this use of, one, China that has a very beefed up Coast Guard. And obviously they are trying to enforce the dotted red line, which extends out to the Spratly Islands and kind of all the territorial waters of Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. But yeah, so the New York Times, great article just showing kind of the ship movement, Chinese ship movement, both of their Coast Guard, but also of their quasi-civilian fleet of fishing boats that also kind of form these blockades and kind of help support the Coast Guard in a quasi-military sort of action as well. Yeah.
I mean, they have military equipment on board these fishing vessels that a normal fishing vessel would not have.
Yeah.
It's just another really big flashpoint between China and East Asia and a U.S. ally. And I think, as with most of these cases, it won't come to violence. I mean, these are important potential violence, but it's clashes with Japan over the Senkaku Islands, Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. and other parts of the world where there's increasing, China's assertive behavior is concerning and increasing, but also designed very carefully not to tip over into any kind of direct violent military conflict.
Yeah. So what's the best response? Essentially kind of like the Philippines or the US with its freedom of navigation, where essentially they'll send vessels through and you'll get harassed, that China won't go up to that point where you just assert that these are international waters and you deal with this harassment. Is that how the best way to keep from being seen of backing down and kind of accepting China's de facto control?
Yeah, which is definitely what the US does. Yeah, and you accept the harassment. I think it is concerning because China has the ability to block the Philippines fishing vessels from those areas which they have claim to and should be able to fish.
Right.
It'll be really interesting to see when the Philippines begins to explore for oil and gas off its waters, if China will use the same tactics and prevent that from happening.
Yeah, and I think that one's complicated because there actually, in the last couple of days, it just shows you how complicated these relationships are. But there have been talks between Philippines and China for joint exploration because these are capital-intensive projects. So to get investment, you look to whoever, even if that's the same country that is harassing your other industries.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a fact we have to keep in mind with China too. Whenever we say all these countries will side with the US if it was US versus China, and why countries do not want to have to choose between the two, because even when they have these conflicts that are quite damaging to a certain extent, they are not willing to cut off like their trade with China and other potential investment opportunities. So
right, yeah.
So there's not a lot more there, but it is an issue that's been in the news a lot the past couple of weeks, and thought it was definitely worth talking about. And the greater awareness of Chinese tensions that go beyond Taiwan and include all these other disputes. So another kind of fascinating conflict, we normally think of South America as the place the U.S. doesn't need to pay attention to in the same way with military conflicts. But quite recently, Venezuela has taken claim or been more assertive in its claim over the neighboring country of Guyana, which it claims 3/4 of the country. Now, this claim is a very old claim, and maps in Venezuela have always shown that as being part of Venezuela. There was a referendum on taking this claim of 61,000 square miles, in which 95% supported it, and is one of the reasons why people think Maduro is taking this action is because of the upcoming presidential elections and the need for domestic support. And this is actually a very popular issue. But of course, the more pertinent issue, why now, is the fact that very recently, Guyana has discovered huge oil deposits and making them one of the fastest growing economies, going from one of the very poorest countries in the region to one of the fastest growing. Total reserves are now estimated to be 11 billion barrels. It would make the country the 4th largest offshore producer in the world. Oil now makes up 62% of GDP, up from 2% in 2019. Of course, this comes with the danger of the resource curse and kind of a lot of complexity, how that will affect Guyana's economy. But that's not really the issue. The issue is Venezuela trying to become more assertive in making this claim. Also, kind of as a bit of background to understand the claim itself, is that Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana were all part of this Spanish colony altogether. And when they split up, there's long disputed borders between Venezuela and Colombia, Venezuela and Guyana. And I do think Brazil is part of this dispute to some extent as well. So basically, the British in 1835 claimed Guyana as part of British Guyana and set the borders there. And then in 1899, the U.S. was on the side of Venezuela, challenged those borders, but ultimately there was a referendum, an international commission by 2 Americans, 2 British, and 1 Russian, and the Russian essentially broke the tie, and both countries backed down. As a complete aside to this, one of the interesting things I found when I was studying rivals as a potential topic for my dissertation, is this is really the first incident where the United States and Britain almost have a conflict, but then back down. And this is actually the start of the ending of their rivalry to where they're going to become alliance partners and just a few years later in World War I. So it's just a really notable kind of transition between the UK and the US as an aside. But going back to Venezuela, so what is Venezuela really going to do? That's the big question. Will it engage in some sort of military action? So what do you make of this conflict?
I think it's interesting, mostly for the historic. I had no idea that it dated back to the colonial period. I think it is interesting, like you said, the involvement and the conflict between the US and the UK. Interesting that, this is one of the most clear assertions of the Monroe Doctrine. Mm-hmm. And it was really the fact that the British rejected kind of the legitimacy of the Monroe Doctrine, and the Cleveland administration kind of threw a fit around it, along with the yellow journalism back then, because this is right before the Spanish-American War, when kind of yellow journalism was at its peak. So there's a lot of rah-rah around the flag and ready to go to war against the UK, essentially to defend the borders of Venezuela.
Right.
So it's always kind of interesting from that perspective. I think, and there was an interesting quote from a Venezuelan political commentator, Francisco Toro, and it was basically like, if we start disputing like every 19th century colonial border, then there's going to be a lot of issues around the world, because these are all arbitrary to a certain extent. So I think it would set a enormously bad precedent if there were any sort of revisions around this, one way or the other. So it's interesting. So it did create an immediate response and stir. You mentioned the Brazilian troops on the border, but then a lot of the Caribbean nations essentially got involved as well. They threw together a conference. So both presidents of Guyana and Venezuela actually met on the island of St. Vincent on December 14th. And essentially, they've agreed to a 3-month study, which I can imagine which each side is going to come to the same conclusion they've come up with the last 120 years, and then meet again in Brazil. So it'll be kind of interesting. I agree. I think this is just a political stunt. I don't know when the election is for Maduro, but I think he'll keep it an issue until right after the election, and then it'll probably be dropped.
And he did this a few years back too, surrounding waters of Guyana. I don't think maybe he was quite as assertive, but this was around the time that they were just discovering oil in the area.
Yeah, that's definitely a big driver of it. And of course, it's a joke because Venezuela has plenty of oil resources that it's not exploiting. And because they drove out, like you mentioned in your research numerous times, they drove out all of the technical professionals and the foreign capital needed to make full use of Venezuela's existing resources. So it's kind of a joke thinking they can drive Exxon out, which is also one of their stipulations. Exxon's the one that took the risk and the investment in this discovery. And Venezuela says they'll drive them out in 3 months and take over a territory to do what? They haven't done anything with their own resources.
Right. One of the interesting things about that is Chevron still operates within the country of Venezuela, and they do talk about partnering with Chevron to develop these oil resources.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I forgot, because I think that was part of because it's fairly recent that Chevron re-entered in because their industry is in such a bad state. So it would be a coup. It's an inter-American oil company. Okay. Now that makes more, because I was thinking, the state-owned company. But yeah, if Chevron comes in and takes over, that would be, that'll never happen. But it's kind of amusing to think about.
Yeah, definitely. And the reason why Brazil is involved, I thought was interesting because Guyana is so rural that the only way into the country is through Brazil, through roads in Brazil. Mm-hmm. Because Venezuela would have to
go.
That
would be the only route, because there's no direct route. Okay. Because I guess it's very mountainous on
the actual border, the land border between Venezuela and Guyana. Yeah. There's no crossings, at least as if there's no roads that cross directly.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that's definitely something taking place that is just another place where the U.S. has to be able to deal with multiple conflicts around the world. And again, something that is important to our military readiness and even industrial base. Not that I think that there would be an actual war, but just another area that the U.S. gets drawn into.
Yep.
So there were the Dutch elections recently, and I know you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah. So the Netherlands held its parliamentary elections on November 22nd, and the world was pretty shocked by the victory of the far-right Freedom Party, which is led by Dutch politician Geert Wilders. And his party won 37 out of the 150 seats in the lower house of the parliament, which is more than in any other group. It's notable because the extremeness of the Freedom Party platform under Geert Wilders. So just to give you an idea, and Wilders has been a public figure since we lived in the Netherlands in the early 2000s, and really came to the forefront because of his anti-Islamic stance and anti-immigrant stance. He's been quoted as saying that Islam is an ideology of a retarded culture and that Moroccans are scum. And he really grew strength following an incident in 2004. So the Freedom Party itself was started in 2004. And he left the center-right party, the VVD or the VVD, due to its weak immigration policy and stance on Islam. But a lot of the radicalization that we even began to witness in the Netherlands really stemmed from a single incident, and it was the murder of Theo van Gogh in Amsterdam. And this occurred in broad daylight. So it was in his morning commute. He was a filmmaker, and essentially he was shot and stabbed by a Dutch citizen of Moroccan descent. Now, Van Gogh was a controversial figure. Like I mentioned, he was a filmmaker and a public intellectual. And months before, his film was shown on national television that depicted quotes from the Quran on a naked female body that came along with commentary, because essentially it was about the abuse that occurs within Islamic societies. So it was this murder in broad daylight that really shocked the Dutch public. I know from what we saw while we were there were numerous mosques throughout the country that were attacked shortly after the event. We had, over time, immigrant-owned stores. For instance, we, in our town of Groningen that we lived in, which is in the northern part of the Netherlands, it's a university town, actually drove out where we would buy our kind of American products and things.
There's an international store, yeah.
An international store. And essentially it was replaced by a very, which you do not see in this part of the Netherlands, but a very obviously Dutch store with a Dutch flag selling Dutch food.
Yeah.
It looked like a tourist thing more than anything. But it was, this very visceral reaction. Now, keep in mind, this is the period of right after September 11th. So there is that general kind of fear of radical Islam. You had the Iraq War going on, which again was opposed by most Europeans. But there was this undercurrent of anti-Islam going on, and this murder really set things off. So that's really kind of the origin story in my mind of kind of Geert Wilders and then of his party.
I remember there was some consternation among the international community because he was the mayor of Rotterdam, I believe, at the time. And
yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
He wanted to make everyone speak Dutch. Like you couldn't speak any other language on the streets. And so there's so many English-speaking people in that area of the Netherlands because of all the international organizations and such.
Yeah.
And it wasn't targeted at English, but it certainly was something that there was a lot of consternation about.
Yeah.
I mean, because obviously English would have been included in that. I don't know how that would have been enforced, but was certainly sort of one of the ways he expressed his views at the time.
Yeah, and I think his views became even more radical over time, especially since the period in 2015, we had a huge number of Syrian migrants enter Europe. And then obviously the rise of Trump and kind of change attitudes within US and kind of giving permission to far-right radicals and voicing these views. But the Freedom Party ran under a very radical platform. So I'll just read a couple of the items. So they want to abolish mosque and the Quran in the whole country of the Netherlands. They want to ban Muslim schools. They have a referendum to leave the EU. On the domestic side, they want to restore Dutch border controls, detain and deport illegal immigrants, reintroduce work permits, even for intra-EU workers. And I mean, the first two items are unconstitutional under the Dutch constitution. So the idea of banning a religion and its religious texts in private schools.
I think it's also important to know the background of why you have religious schools. So in the history of the tensions between, or conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism, basically, because you had the very southern part that was Catholic, the way they dealt with that was to have completely separate schools for the Catholics and for Protestants. And basically, the Muslim community sort of took over that. And so that's why they have separate Muslim schools, is part of that legacy and is why it's part of the Constitution. And I just want to explain that because that's kind of unusual. One of the negative things that leads to is the lack of integration into mainstream society, which of course is the point, because Catholicism and Protestants had totally two different societies, right?
Right.
So it's almost the intention of creating these religious schools was to have a not integrated society, but it's been a particular problem for having so much immigration and allowing for them to have their own separate schools and separate communities.
Yeah. So I think, that has been a major issue, is the lack of integration, particularly of Muslim populations. It's an issue in the Netherlands and Germany and in France. Kind of famously, France kind of has the colonial layer upon it as well with Algeria. So he did not get an out-and-out majority. So he's trying to form a coalition. But because he ran on this platform, which is unconstitutional, the mainstream parties have been reluctant. So the previous head of the last government, so Prime Minister Mark Rutte's party, the VVD, has come out and said they don't want to be part of a governing coalition, which is a major blow because center-right would be a natural ally with kind of the far-right Freedom Party. And then the NSC, which stands for New Social Contract, which are seen as moderates, don't want to be part of the party unless he drops the platform around not only the banning of mosque and the Quran, the Muslim schools, but also says that the Netherlands will continue its support for Ukraine and staying within the EU. So basically getting rid of almost the entire platform that he ran on, short of maybe the one area where all the parties agree on the right is to restrict migration going forward, probably make greater language demands, because that's probably now seen as a moderate position, having to learn Dutch and speak Dutch on the street. But it's really not clear, because it's been over a month. He's not any closer to getting a governing coalition. But apparently, I didn't realize this, but even with the last one under Mark Rutte, it took them 200 days to form a government. But I think it's going to be even more difficult given what a radical position he's at. So maybe they're not able to form a coalition. You may even see something put together from the left Green parties and then the moderate. So it's really kind of a mess right now. And it doesn't seem like they're very close to being able to form a government. And even then, I can't imagine it being a very strong voting coalition. Nevertheless, I think it's rattled a number of people. It's the same dynamic as the US, where you have a urban core that voted for the Greens and for the liberals. And they've basically, some of the quotes were, "This is our Trump moment. This is deeply embarrassing."
It's kind of the Trump moment.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of the Trump
I agree
moment.
with them.
But without the power of the presidency. That's the difference of the systems. But then in the rural areas, so more out not where, I mean, we still live in Groningen. Groningen's actually a hotbed of Marxist, literal Marxist and Marxist thought.
Surrounded by a rural area.
Surrounded by very rural, and that's most of the Netherlands. You don't have to go very far and you're out in cow pasture, essentially. But there's quotes from rural farmers then are like, well, we can't bring all of Africa here. And more of the foreigners arrive with no real reason for asylum. Right. So they were all real thrilled.
A lot of anti-immigration sentiment.
Very xenophobic. Not just Africans, although probably a heightened level, particularly for them, but also for any EU foreigners from Eastern Europe.
Yeah, they didn't particularly like any outsiders.
Yeah, which always ran against what they have very good marketing, the Dutch, in terms of their open, tolerant society. And that has been true historically, but it seems pretty challenged right now. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of those same parallels as what we see in the U.S. This growing diversity within their country, a rural-urban divide, impact of inflation was definitely mentioned a lot, people complaining about that. I think unlike the U.S., the employment situation is much worse there, particularly for young people and young graduates. So the opportunity. So it's natural to blame kind of the immigrant and the outsider on. That being said, just in seeing some of the comments from opinion pieces like in the New York Times of people kind of writing in, there is a very strong feeling towards kind of what you said of these Muslim populations do not integrate successfully. And that's something that was repeated. I mean, this is the New York Times, so you're going to get pretty liberal base reading it. But comment after comment was these people do not integrate within our societies.
But I think I want to emphasize it's not their fault. It's sort of the way it's set up is to keep communities separate.
Yeah.
And that was something I remember being talked about while we lived there, is just that's a problem in Dutch society, is the way that they have formed these institutions to keep communities completely separate.
Yeah, because I feel like the Anglo countries have a much better history of even integrating societies and cultures that are very different from them. Like I would think like the Muslim population in the US integrates very well. Depends
who you ask, but yes.
Yeah, I would say it integrates very well compared to, I mean, and I don't know the state so much because I always think of France, where France is very much the ghettoization and isolation of these populations. And it's not this successful integration. So I'm not sure what it is about the Canadian, the UK, the American model of integrating these populations. But I look at the numbers, it's like 5% of the population. I'm like, why can't you integrate 5% of the population?
They would have to fundamentally change the institutions and not have religious schools at all.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, that's it. I did not think of it from kind of that religious and that the whole Catholic Protestant split. But no, that's an interesting point.
Yeah. Well, I could discuss this a lot more, but we wanted to do some predictions. So we should probably go on to that.
Yep. So I think just as a kind of fun end to the 2023 and looking ahead to what looks to be a very eventful 2024, that we would emulate what The Economist has kind of put together, where it used a service of super predictors, super forecasters. I forgot the name of the company that puts this together, but basically it's experts and all of these different areas, and they're asked to make predictions, and it's kind of this wisdom of crowds and I don't know if like investors then use the service to make bets on, or if it is strictly just like a UK betting market.
Anyone can participate in it, and then it would show like how well you did compared to what happened, or was it to what other people predicted? I don't know. I didn't do very well. So we should just say I'm really bad at predictions.
Okay. So we're going to go through this pretty rapidly, but I grabbed mostly questions from this Economist poll, and then the remainder, I think I just threw in from the top of my head. So here we go. All right. So first one, how much territory will Russia hold at the end of 2024 of Ukraine? So it currently holds 18% of the territory.
Same.
I'm going to say 20%.
I almost was going to go with 20%. I mean, this is just saying the U.S. gets their act together, but nothing really changes, and there's just nothing to really change it.
Yeah.
It's stalled out.
Yeah, I'm going to say that maybe they make some modest gains, but the U.S. does get its act together in EU and keeps it funded. Okay, so next question. Will Russia and Ukraine sign or announce an agreement to end the war next year?
No, but there might be talks.
I'm going to say no, and there'll be talk if the Trump administration is elected. But I think that's actually too early for talk, but maybe, they would begin preliminary talks if Trump wins. Okay, next question. Who will win the next UK general election? Just for context, it's going to be, you have Conservatives, the Tories currently in power, have been in power for, I think, 15 years, the Labour government, and what's the last one?
I don't know. The Tories, the Tories are going to win because Labour still doesn't have its act together.
Wow. No, I think Labour wins.
Really?
Yeah. Tories are enormously unpopular. I think Sunak's done a good job of just having low profile and just being a pragmatic dude, but it's not going to save. Tories are going to get pounded, absolutely destroyed.
I kind of defer to your prediction because I really don't know anything about it.
Okay. Next question. Will a Quad country or China publicly accuse the other of using a weapon against its military or other forces?
No.
I'm going to say no, too. I thought that was a weird question, but it was in there.
I think China is very careful to go up to the line, but not cross it.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, next question. When will Mahmoud Abbas cease to be president of the Palestinian Authority? I guess we're saying this, I guess you can say not this year, but we're not 2024.
Yeah, not 2024.
Okay. I'm going to say middle part of 2024, like August.
Okay.
Do I have a reasoning behind this? No, but I think let's go to the next question that feeds into this. Okay. Will there be a war between Hezbollah and Israel in 2024? No. I'm going to say no as well. What month will Israel end combat operations in Gaza? You can also say not in 2024.
Not in 2024.
Wow. Okay.
Or at the very end of 2024.
Okay. I'm going to say April.
Really? That early?
Yeah, because I think U.S. pressure is going to be pretty extreme.
All right. Maybe towards the end of 2024. I'm revising.
Okay. And that ties into my Abbas. So I'm thinking, with operations over by the spring, that somehow he's pressured to step down so that Gaza, the PLA can take over in Gaza. So that's my prediction. Okay, next one. What will U.S. GDP growth average over the next year?
Wow, 5%.
Boom times. I think Biden, that definitely will answer the presidential election. I'm going to say a solid 3% next year, which would still be real good. And obviously a soft landing, total victory for the Fed.
Haven't we been at like 5%?
Yeah, last quarter.
Well,
that's not going to stay at 5. You think it's going to stay? All right, I'm going to put you down for 5%. Well, what's China's GDP growth going to average?
5%.
5%. I'm going to say, I don't trust any of their numbers. I think the real one is like 3%, but what the report is 5%.
I think the report 7%.
Okay. All right. We got all the reported and actual numbers. All right. And then finally, the big one, the only one that really matters. Who will win the U.S. presidential election? Well, no. Okay. Let's start off with, we'll build up to that one. Who will win Congress next year? So you have the House and the Senate. Who will control each? And then by what margin?
No.
Okay. Just who's going to control each?
I don't know. I don't know any of these. I'm just going to preference. These are just random guesses. So you could flip a coin. I'm going to say the House goes Democrat by 1 or 2, and the Senate is tied.
Okay. I agree. I think the Democrats take the House, mostly driven from elections in New York and California. I think their margin's bigger. I'm going to say like a 10-seat margin. And the Senate, I'm going to agree with you and say it's tied. You get some mixed results there. Okay, so now the big one, U.S. presidential election and prediction on the Electoral College vote.
I'm not doing the latter one.
That's sad.
All right, so here's why I'm predicting Biden. Because I cannot possibly entertain the notion of, like, it depresses me. It's not like 2016 where I just couldn't entertain the notion of a Trump presidency, but now I can't entertain it without crying. So I have to say my hope, which is Biden.
Okay. I'm going to agree. I think it's going to be real tight, extremely ugly, but I think Biden takes it by similar margins as last time. So around 300 electoral votes. So not maybe closer to that, but I still think that's probably just Trump has such tremendous baggage. I think there is a real possibility. I should have had on there, will Trump, let's add another one. Will Trump be convicted of any of the 91 felonies that he currently faces before the election?
In the federal trial, I don't think so. The only one, maybe Georgia. I don't know. Probably not.
Yeah.
It probably just will get delayed.
I'm predicting that he will get convicted on at least one count in these trials. That one of them will push forward during the election.
I see that.
Yeah.
Again, I see that more as a hope.
Yep. And based on what UK betting markets are currently saying, Donald Trump has a 44% chance of winning, which is the highest percentage because Joe Biden is currently at 33%. And then for some reason they have Nikki Haley at 10%. I don't think the UK betting markets actually understand our political system.
No.
So they're probably not a good reference, but that's where they stand out. And it's the only place you can bet. You can't bet on markets here. We just have the sports betting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So we'll tally that up and check in next year.
Have we even gone back and looked at the predictions we made last year?
We didn't do any predictions.
We didn't?
No.
Oh, we were smarter.
Yeah.
I predict that I do badly. I don't know why.
With that attitude.
I don't know why. I just am bad at it. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and follow us on Twitter at Global Kellogg or me, AR Kellogg.
And you can reach us by email. So Anita at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com. As always, please see the show notes for any of the articles we discussed in this episode. And if you like the show, please take the time, tell your friends, and share it on your social sites. It's a simple, quick, and free way to support the show.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.